This is specifically for the folks that keep on saying, but this is history. Why are you bringing up history? Well, regardless if you're white or black, this is part of your history. This is part of the country's history. This helps us understand systemic issues related to the country. Okay? And I can't erase history, and nor should you, just because you feel uncomfortable. So just put your big girl panties on. Also, another thing that I want to highlight is it's not so far away. It was one generation away that this history took place. So it has an impact today. And the people that did those kind of things did not feel the full extent of the law. In fact, they went into positions of power in political parties. And I'll give you an example. Meet Sam Pienaar. Now, Sam Pienaar, in 2011 to 2016, was a Democratic Alliance ward councillor. He was also a prominent Western Cape educationist who formerly commanded citizen force troops on the Cape Flats. This man became a Democratic Alliance ward councillor, and he was in education, okay? But he was at the planning meeting for the Trojan Horse, where Jonathan Claassen, 21, Sean Mahmoud, 15, and Michael Miranda, 11, were killed and several others were injured. And all of a sudden, in 2016, I don't know what happened with the Democratic Alliance, if they had an aversion to history, all of a sudden found out that the same man actually had to testify at the TRC because of his involvement in the Trojan Horse operation. So honestly, please get over yourselves and let's educate ourselves on history.
Emakosini Thokozani Camagu, thank you for joining me for another video. As we move closer to the elections, I felt moved to think about who I'm gonna vote for, how do I want to vote, trying to pick up the manifestos of the parties that perhaps I was interested. I felt moved to seriously ask myself a few questions. Can I list, number one, everything that's wrong with South Africa? Number two, is it possible to fix those things? And so, as I'm thinking about these things, my ancestor reminds me something that they are continuously reminding me, that we are them in the physical here on earth. So I was a bit confused, but he continued to explain. If we compare the environment that apartheid laws created during that time and the environment that we have now due to the laws we have, apartheid and even colonialism, was not a conducive environment compared to now. So there has been a form of progress. Today, the more each family stands on their culture, whilst at the same time rectifying the karma in their bloodline, the more righteousness will reign. The more the ancestors will begin to move on our behalf, because the kingdom of heaven must reign now on earth, and it is already happening. Granted, maybe not everything is fixable at this point, but some things are. To the ANC's defense, I think the problem is that we're expecting them to reverse centuries of colonialism and then apartheid in a space of 30 years. I agree, there has been progress, but I also agree that it could have been more. For instance, we could have removed pit latrines by now in schools alone, just in schools. I think the amount of corruption right now, I don't think anyone has any more stomach for it. Like, South Africa has become, angazi, a soapy I don't know, a sitcom. I don't know. But the main issue affecting, well, at least my ancestors, is the land. Yeah, those forced removals. But my point is, whatever we do, we need to create a more conducive environment for our ancestors. Because perhaps the land issue, for instance, is their case that needs to be dealt with in the Most High's court. Because our ancestors are fully aware of how sensitive and complicated that matter is today. And the more we cleanse our bloodline from the karma that runs through it, is the more we'll be in the right position to move when the time comes. But before you fix something, you have to find out how it broke, what went wrong, and the extent of the damage. And so this calls for us to take a look at history to fully, or at least try to fully understand the extent of damage done by colonialism and apartheid, and why the country is the way it is today. I don't know, maybe I'm talking nonsense, but thank you for watching this video. Thokozani.
And the apathy of these children are the all too familiar signs of malnutrition. For a family to survive, the men have to go away to the cities to work for the whites. It's often impossible for the women left behind to grow enough food because drought and soil erosion have destroyed the land. An official report estimated that the Bantustans could provide a subsistence living for only 2.5 million people. Today, already 7 million people are forced to live in them. As more people are herded into the Bantustans, the standard of living declines further. The income of each person here is now only £13 a year, among the lowest in the world. And yet, only 100 years ago, before the white conquest, the forefathers of these people were famous for their large herds of cattle. Today, the children are in tatters, and the women grow old in their 20s. The white government claims that under apartheid, the blacks can develop separately in the Bantustans. But the conditions of life here make a mockery of any of the government's claims of separate development. For even the government can no longer pretend that there's any land for the people they are moving to the Bantustans from the townships. For most of these families are put in specially built camps like this one. This is called Ozizweni and is in a KwaZulu Bantustan. Families who have lived all their lives in towns are given a one-room hut like this for their new home. There's nothing for the families in these camps. No land and no work. The people try and survive on the meager earnings from their absent husbands, brothers and sons who are away working in the cities. The government's justification for these mass removals was given by Mr. Botha, the Minister for Bantu Administration and Development.
The Bantu people like being moved. The Bantu people like the places where they are being resettled.
Already in the last 10 years, 1.5 million people have been moved. And the government plans to uproot a further 4 million blacks in the largest forced movement of people in peacetime.
Changes which are to come can only come as a result of a program worked out by black people. And for black people to be able to work out a program, they need to defeat the one main element in politics which was working against them, and this was the psychological feeling of inferiority.
We earned our flag. What did you do for yours?
Так дайте пацанам посчитать потери. Суммы нули погибают на сцене. Снова один прогуляюсь без тени. Заливаю лид, поцелуй на шею. Капитан Блан, правда назад, черный каскад. Вижу твой взгляд, степ на горят. Мог тебя взять, но ты не...
I don't agree with a government, a sham government. No man walks out of prison after 27 years and becomes the president unless there's a script and a plan behind the scene to remove the economic sanctions from whites in South Africa, with no real plan for redistribution of the wealth. The Oppenheimers, the De Beers, and others, they are sucking the blood of our people.
How did white South Africans get so wealthy? South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. And it freaks me out how many South Africans complain about BEE, or they say 30 years of democracy, isn't that enough for you? In exactly that accent. And how little most South Africans know about economic apartheid. How far colonial and apartheid governments went to lift up white people and suppress people of color for hundreds of years. The simple truth is, black economic empowerment is nothing compared to white economic empowerment. Your parents may have worked hard, very hard, but the paler their skin, the more they benefited from extraordinary government economic aid. And here's when old people say, oh no, but what about this black person who's wealthy, or this black person who's made a lot of money? But here's the thing, right? Bad systems always hide behind miracle cases, the radical exceptions that make it out of a bad system even though it doesn't support them at all. They try to make it look like the exception, the miracle, is the average person in the system. And everybody who doesn't make it, well, that's their fault. It's not the system's fault. So here's the issue with white economic empowerment: how white people benefited from extraordinary government economic intervention. You know that speaking about apartheid is hard. So much of it happened off the record, people dispute it. So I'm going to make this super simple. All I'm going to do is tell you about a handful of apartheid policies that were enacted on the record, no doubt about it, that advantaged white people and oppressed black people. So let's start in 1910, when the Union of South Africa was formed. Literally, the country was invented for the first time, and government policies affected everybody in the country. The Second South African War had just ended. It was between the Brits and the Boers, and the Brits won. But they wanted to unite all white people together, especially Afrikaners, because they'd been fighting each other and killing each other for years. And so immediately, they made it that no people of color could vote. Instantly, unite the white people, only they can vote, only they can control the making of the new country. Then in 1913, the Land Act made it illegal, impossible for black people to own land outside of reserves. That meant 93% of all land in South Africa was only available to white people. Then, in the early 1920s, poor white Afrikaners protested that most of big industry was dominated by British companies, and those companies were hiring skilled black workers over them. In response, the government funded enormous public works programs, like building the Hartbeespoort Dam, and they only hired poor white workers. They literally made programs to make jobs for poor white, particularly Afrikaner workers. Also in 1925, the Wage Act made a minimum wage for white workers but not black workers, and the government offered incentives to companies applying for tenders. The more white workers you employ, the more likely you are to win work. Let's jump to 1948, when the National Party returns to power and formalizes apartheid for the very first time. And the first thing they do is direct massive funding to social programs and welfare grants for poor white people, and slashed funding for people of color across the board. In 1950, the Group Areas Act stopped black people from moving through South Africa freely. They had to get permission to go places, always on white people's terms, and this made it incredibly hard to find work. In the 1950s and 60s, the apartheid government fixed black people's pensions, which meant that as inflation increased, the value of those pensions got less. At the same time, white people's pensions increased dramatically. Black South Africans were forced into the Bantu Education Act in 1953, where they were literally only taught how to do basic unskilled labor. They were reduced to servitude. The Nats worked incredibly hard to promote white, specifically Afrikaner-owned business. You know why the Nats had African language radio stations through the SABC? to make money for white people off of black people. In the 60s, the apartheid government handed out millions of radios and ran the African language stations themselves. Obviously, they used it for propaganda to try and control the flow of information around apartheid, but they also gave ad space, reaching this massive new audience to white, especially Afrikaner-owned businesses at knockdown rates. And some of the biggest companies in South Africa today started that way. Afrikaner-owned, benefiting from ad space on African language radio stations that the apartheid government handed them. I could go on, you get the point. And you know what I said earlier about the average experience showing what the system actually does? Well, let's look at what the apartheid system did to South Africa. In 1996, the first ever truly national census was taken, where all South Africans were asked what the reality of their lives were like. Because of apartheid, the 1996 census found that 21% of black South Africans lived in informal housing. That's over 6 million people. And you know how many white South Africans lived in informal housing in 1996? 0.1%. More than 7 million black South Africans in 1996 had no access to piped water. 97% of white South Africans had access to piped water. Let's talk about refuse removal. 59% of black South Africans had no access to regular refuse removal in 1996, more than 18 million people. 92% of white South Africans had access. Electricity. 56% of black South Africans had no access to electricity in 1996 at all, more than 17 million people. 99.6% of all white South Africans had good access to electricity. That is the reality that economic apartheid created in this country. A few weeks ago, there was a news headline. It said, South Africa not ready for a white president. And you know how sometimes you see a news headline and you think, what a waste. Like, why did you waste the ink and paper on that? Obviously, South Africa's not ready for a white president. Although it does make sense when you see who said that quote. It was the leader of the Freedom Front Plus. Sorry, Die Vryheidsfront Plus. This quote actually annoys me so much because it feels like it's implying that South Africans who aren't ready for a white president are somehow being unreasonable or should change or should think again. I mean, seriously, after centuries of abuse and oppression based on race by white people, and now what? They want trust. They want forgive and forget. That show got cancelled. Trust is earned, and I would say it's pretty damn reasonable to wait a little while longer to see if that trust is deserved. So, that's the issue with white economic empowerment. Thank you so much for watching this episode of The Issue with Dan Corder. We release one episode every single week on YouTube, and we also have a podcast, which you can find on all the streaming platforms, and you can find our socials in the video bio. Please like, subscribe, spread the word. See you soon.